Hello! In this lecture we will try to actually interact with the database somewhat. We will begin with the basics, of course, and we will try to create an actual database, and then we will create a little table in the database. So first of all, what you need to understand is that when you go to your SQL server, that is the connection. So this is the SQL server, and all these components are in the SQL server. This isn't a database. The database is the databases actually are in this folder, in this databases folder. And as you can see, you have some system databases already, and then you have some database snapshots. It's not what we are going to be looking at. What we want to do is we want to create a database. Now, in the SQL server, you can have as many databases as you want. However, if you really need to have a lot of diversifying in terms of holding your data with storage places, you should probably deal with several different servers and displace the data accordingly so that if one breaks, the others do not. But let's start with one first, and we have this server. So let's go to the databases, and you right click on the databases, like that, and it sometimes takes a bit of time to load. But now you go to new database, and you will start creating that database. Now, we will also later take a look at some connection strings, how to connect remotely to the database, but at first we will just be going through some basics. Now, here you need to enter the name for the database. As you can see, you have database files. So these are all default. You don't need to do anything with these. As you can see, you have some path for that, where the actual file for the database is held. And then you have the log, so it's the same thing. We won't be dealing with that yet. And now let's create a database. So let's call it test database 1. So let's do the first database, because we will be working with the same server throughout the course, and then we will create several other databases. We will try to work with them together, merge them, and do some interesting stuff. But first, let's start with creating one. So we've entered the name, and as you can see, you have options as well. Let's look at that. So there are many options. You have compatibility levels. So as you can see, if you need compatibility with 2017 or some earlier version, you can do that as well. Now you have recovery mode, containment type, all that stuff we will look at later. And then what we have here, we have all these parameters, options. So we will look at some of them later as well. And then you have the file groups, so we don't really need to deal with file groups right now as well. So we have general. So again, if you just need a database, you go with the general. And also there's the owner. So this time we will do default. And then later, when we will be looking at some security stuff with the databases, we will be dealing with different owners for different databases. So now you just click OK, and as you can see, it's executing, and it will soon be ready. Now once it is ready, let's look at what it has in store there. So let's expand that, and then we have, so as you can see, we have the database in the databases folder here. And then we have tables, views, external resources, and all that stuff. So the main things you need to look at usually is the programmability. So in the programmability, you have stored procedures. Now, the stored procedures you can call upon especially if you're using SQL Server not from the SQL Server but from some other application. So whether it is C# or C++ application, it's easier to use stored procedures. You just store procedure, you pass on some arguments there, and you call it, execute it, and you have some insertion or you retrieve some data. It's very easy to use, and you will see all that later. But for now, let's expand the tables and we will look what's in it. And then we will actually create a table. We will create a table, and as you can see, you have some default ones. You have these default folders. We don't need to look at them. We will actually, in the later lectures, take a look at file tables. It's gonna be a completely different thing. But for now, you just right-click on the tables. Right-click on the tables like that, and you go to New. You go to New, and you go to Table. Now again, you see that there are many tables. You have memory optimized, you have temporal table, and then you have even more options, and you have graph. So you have node and edge, you have external, you have file. File is actually very useful, but we will start with a simple table just like that. As you can see, it will soon be created. Now you can also do all that through the syntax. So I will show you where to access syntax later. Now we won't be actually doing that because there's no point in creating this kind of a database using this plain syntax. We just use the user interface. It's a lot quicker, a lot more efficient. Now you have a column name, and you have a data type, and you have allow nulls. So the first thing, in any database, you need some kind of an ID for the row. So you have column names, and then you have rows. And for any database, you need a unique ID for each and every row. It has to be unique. So you can either go through the trouble and generate your own ID, or you can use some of the already existing features to generate one of those IDs. Now this time I'm just gonna use the number ID, so it's gonna start at 1 and it will go and go and go up to whatever number you need. And then later, once we're dealing with the insertions, I will show you how to create this sort of text ID. So you will see all that. So first of all, you do ID. You don't have to call it ID, but usually it's probably better to call it ID. Now then you do integer. So you have the data type. As you can see, it is rather slow today. But you have the data type, and you have several different data types. If we expand that, you can see that you have nchar and text, numeric, and char, and then you have real and text and timestamp and all those different data types. And we will actually be looking at integer. But basically, the most common ones will probably be n.char, then you have date time, and then you also have the integer, and then you'll also have decimal. So we will look at those now. So let's do first of all integer for the ID. And then here you need to find something called identity. So if you can see here, you have identity specification. Let's expand that. It says is identity, and it says no. Now we do actually need the identity, so let's change that to yes. And as you can see, you have identity increment 1, identity seed 1. So identity seed is the number at which the enumeration starts. So it starts from 1 and it adds 1. if you would do, say, identity seed 10 and then increment 10, the first record would be ID 10 and the second one would be ID 20. Now that is actually very pointless, so you usually just do 1 and 1. So now we have that. And also I have to mention, for the ID you have to have not null, so you cannot allow nulls for the IDs. Now moving forward, you can set it as a primary key. We won't get into the functionality of that, but you should do that. You should do that for the ID. So you right click on the row, on the column actually, or on the row here. So you click on that and you do set primary key. So now as you can see, you have this little key icon and you'll be able to see that it is actually primary key. Now we won't get into that, but it's a good idea to place that on ID. Next, let's do some other type, and let's do a string or text type. So let's do text test. Let's do text test. So with text you have char type, char, and then you have nchar, and then you have nvarchar, nvarchar. Now I would suggest using nvarchar because it will hold any character you want. The others will not do that same thing. But again, if you really want to save some space, you might look at the other options, and what I would suggest you do, you just go to the documentation, you go to the character sets, character types you are using in your application, what kind of input you might expect, and then you adjust this type accordingly. I personally would not take that risk unless I was absolutely sure that I won't get any Chinese characters or something like that. So you just do nvarchar and you feel very safe. And we can allow nulls, we don't have to, so let's take that off. And then now let's look at a final type. There are of course many others, but we will look at all of them, most of them actually, not all of them, later. So we will look now at decimal. So let's do dec test, DEC test. And the decimal type is a decimal type. As you can see, the whole language is very suggestive. So you do decimal, and when you see we have a number on the left and then another number on the right. So the number on the left states how many digits will the number hold, and then the number on the right states how many of those digits will be after the decimal number. So after that dot, if you have 2.22, those two will be after the dot. So that is where the second number comes in. It specifies how many digits can the decimal number hold. Decimal digits. So let's do 18 and then let's do 2. So this is something you would do for money. Although SQL Server does have a money type, but I would personally prefer doing decimal, or even better doing integer type for the money. So you do cents. But we will get a bit to that later. So now you've seen how we would create the database. We just actually need to save that. So let's call it test table, and that's it. We have it saved. So you've seen how to create the database. You've seen how to create the table in the database, and you've seen some of the most common data types. And then in the next lecture, we will actually try to write a query which will insert some data into those columns and create some rows. And with that, we will conclude this lecture.